The woman stood frozen at the bottom of the church steps, her hand trembling against the iron railing. 20 years had passed since she had climbed these same stairs in the dead of winter, a newborn wrapped in a thin blanket pressed against her chest. She remembered the weight of him, so small, so warm, so completely dependent on her. And she remembered setting him down on the cold stone, backing away into the darkness, her silent screams swallowed by the falling snow. Now, through the stained glass window above, she could see a young man standing at the altar. He was wearing a priest's collar, and he was smiling. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret Ellis stood in the shadow of an old oak tree, watching the church from across the street. Her hands were buried deep in the pockets of her coat, and her breath came out in thin white clouds that disappeared into the cold February air. She had been standing there for nearly an hour. Her feet ached, her back hurt, but she could not move. 20 years, 20 long, impossible years since she had last stood on this ground. The church looked smaller now than she remembered. The stone steps had been repaired. The stained glass windows had been cleaned. A new sign hung near the entrance, painted in elegant gold letters, St. Michael's Catholic Church. Father Daniel Mercer, Pastor. Father Daniel Mercer. Margaret whispered the name to herself, letting it roll across her tongue like a prayer she had forgotten how to speak. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain, what words could possibly bridge the distance between a mother who had walked away and the son she had left behind. But now that she was here, standing so close to the truth, she realized something terrible. She had not come to ask for forgiveness. She had come to warn him. The couple who had raised Daniel, Harold and Vivian Mercer, were not strangers to Margaret. She had never met them face to face, but she knew their names, she knew their history, and she knew what they had done. 20 years ago, when Margaret was young and desperate and alone, Harold Mercer had been the attorney who handled her grandmother's foreclosure. He had sat behind a polished mahogany desk in a downtown office and explained in calm and measured tones that Ruth Ellis had failed to meet her financial obligations. He had shown Margaret the documents, the signatures, the cold legal language that stripped her grandmother of everything she had ever owned. And then, just 3 months later, Vivian Mercer had purchased the farmland at auction for a fraction of its worth. Margaret remembered reading about it in the newspaper. She remembered the photograph of Vivian standing in front of the old farmhouse, smiling like a woman who had just won the lottery. She remembered the bile rising in her throat, the rage that burned so hot she thought it might consume her. But she had been too weak to fight, too broken, too lost in the fog of her own grief to do anything but survive. She had told herself it didn't matter, that the land was just land, that Ruth would have wanted her to move on, to start over, to build something new. But now she knew the truth. The Mercers had not stumbled upon Daniel by accident. They had not found him on the church steps by divine providence or blessed coincidence. They had been watching Margaret for months before she ever set foot in that hospital. They had tracked her financial struggles, her growing desperation, her fragile mental state. They had known, with cold and calculated certainty, that she would eventually break. And when she did, when she walked up those frozen steps and laid her baby down on the cold stone, Harold Mercer had been waiting in the shadows. He had taken Daniel before anyone else could find him. He had filed the adoption papers the very next morning. He had told the town a beautiful story about answered prayers and God's mysterious plan. But it was all a lie. The Mercers had stolen her son. Margaret closed her eyes and let the weight of that truth settle into her bones. She had spent the last 6 months gathering evidence, court records, financial documents, witness statements from neighbors who remembered seeing Harold's car parked near the church that night. It had taken everything she had, every dollar, every ounce of courage, every sleepless night, to piece together the story that no one else had ever thought to question. And now she had a choice to make. She could expose the Mercers. She could go to the police, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. She could tear down the carefully constructed lie they had built and reveal them for what they truly were. But what would that do to Daniel? He was a priest now, a man of God, beloved by his congregation, respected by his community, devoted to a life of service and faith. Everything he believed about himself, his calling, his family, his place in the world, was built on a foundation of sand. If Margaret revealed the truth, she would destroy that foundation. She would shatter the only identity Daniel had ever known. She would force him to confront a past he never asked for and a mother he had every right to hate. And she would lose any chance, however small, however fragile, of ever knowing her son. But if she stayed silent, the Mercers would win. They would continue living their comfortable lives, surrounded by the wealth they had stolen and the son they had taken. They would never face justice. They would never answer for what they had done. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the church one more time. She had already failed Daniel once. Could she afford to fail him again? 20 years earlier, January 1984, a small farmhouse outside of Columbus, Ohio. The morning arrived slowly, the way winter mornings often do in the rural Midwest. First came the pale gray light creeping through the thin curtains. Then came the distant sound of a rooster calling from the neighbor's property, 2 fields over. And finally, the gentle creak of the old farmhouse settling into another day, its wooden bones shifting beneath the weight of decades. Margaret Ellis woke to the smell of coffee. She lay still for a moment, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling above her bed. The room was cold. The space heater in the corner hummed softly, struggling to push warmth into the drafty air. But beneath the heavy quilt her grandmother had made years ago, stitched together from old dresses and faded curtains, Margaret felt safe. She placed a hand on her belly and waited. There it was, a soft flutter like butterfly wings brushing against the inside of her skin. The baby was awake too. "Good morning," she whispered. The kitchen was warm when Margaret finally made her way downstairs. Her grandmother stood at the stove, her back slightly hunched, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun at the base of her neck. She wore the same faded blue housecoat she had worn every morning for as long as Margaret could remember, and her slippers made that familiar shuffling sound against the worn linoleum floor. Ruth Ellis was 73 years old. Her hands trembled slightly when she poured the coffee. Her eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be. But there was a steadiness about her, a quiet strength that had carried Margaret through every storm she had ever faced. "Sit down before you fall down," Ruth said without turning around. "Bacon's almost ready." Margaret smiled and lowered herself into the wooden chair by the window. The table was small, just big enough for 2, and covered with a plastic tablecloth printed with tiny yellow flowers. A mason jar in the center held a single dried sunflower from last summer's garden. Through the frost-covered window, Margaret could see the field stretching out toward the horizon. The snow had fallen thick the night before, blanketing everything in white. The old red barn stood silent in the distance, its doors closed against the cold. A few crows circled lazily above the tree line, black shapes against the pale gray sky. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel small and safe. The kind of morning that made Margaret believe, if only for a little while, that everything might turn out okay. Ruth set a plate in front of her, bacon, eggs, and 2 slices of toast with butter melting into the bread. A small glass of orange juice, a napkin folded neatly beside the fork. "You need to eat more," Ruth said, settling into the chair across from her. "That baby's going to come out hungry if you keep picking at your food like a bird." Margaret laughed softly. "I'm eating, Grandma, I promise." "You're eating like a rabbit. I've seen rabbits eat more than you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the soft crackle of the radio on the counter. An old country song played, something slow and sad about a man who lost his way and a woman who waited for him to come home. Ruth hummed along, her foot tapping gently against the floor. Margaret watched her grandmother's face, the deep lines around her eyes, the softness in her expression. Ruth had taken her in without question when Margaret arrived on her doorstep 3 months ago, pregnant and penniless and too ashamed to look anyone in the eye. She hadn't asked who the father was. She hadn't lectured or judged or turned her away. She had simply opened the door, pulled Margaret into her arms and said, "You're home now. That's all that matters." It was more grace than Margaret had ever known. After breakfast, they washed the dishes together, standing side by side at the old porcelain sink. The water was warm, and the soap smelled like lavender. Margaret dried each plate carefully and stacked them in the cabinet above the stove. "I was thinking," Ruth said, handing her a wet cup, "we could go into town this afternoon. Pick up some more yarn. I want to finish that blanket before the baby comes." Margaret nodded. "That sounds nice. And maybe we could stop by the church, light a candle, say a little prayer." Margaret hesitated. She hadn't been to church in years, not since her mother had dragged her there as a child, forcing her to sit in stiff dresses and recite prayers she didn't understand. But Ruth's eyes were soft, hopeful. "Okay," Margaret said quietly. "We can do that." Ruth smiled and patted her hand. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering everything in white. And for one quiet morning, Margaret allowed herself to believe that the world was gentle, that love was enough, and that nothing bad could ever reach her here. In the weeks that followed, Margaret fell in love in a way she had never experienced before. It was not the rushing, reckless love she had felt for the man who left her. It was not the desperate, aching love she had carried for her mother, who had never learned how to love her back. This was something different, something deeper, something that grew slowly and quietly, like a seed pushing through frozen soil toward the light. She fell in love with her unborn child. It began with the small things, the way he moved inside her, restless and alive, kicking against her ribs in the middle of the night, the way her body changed to make room for him, her belly growing round and full, her skin stretching to hold the miracle taking shape within her. The way she found herself talking to him constantly, as if he could hear every word, as if he already knew her voice and was listening. "I'm going to take care of you," she whispered one evening, lying in bed with her hands pressed against her stomach. "I'm going to give you everything I never had, a real home, a real family, someone who stays." The baby kicked in response, a gentle thump against her palm, and Margaret laughed through her tears. Ruth noticed the change in her. "You're glowing," she said one afternoon, watching Margaret fold a stack of tiny clothes they had found at a church rummage sale. "I haven't seen you smile like that in months." Margaret looked down at the small cotton onesie in her hands. It was white with little blue stars printed across the chest. Someone else's baby had worn it once. Someone else's baby had outgrown it and moved on. Now it would belong to her son. "I didn't think I could feel this way," Margaret admitted quietly. "I didn't think I had it in me." Ruth set down her knitting needles and reached across the table to take Margaret's hand. "You've always had it in you," she said firmly. "You just never had anyone who showed you how." Margaret looked at her grandmother's weathered face, the deep lines carved by years of hard work and quiet sorrow. Ruth had buried a husband and 2 sons. She had survived the Depression, the wars, the slow erosion of everything she had built. And yet here she was, still standing, still giving, still believing that love was worth the risk. "How do you do it?" Margaret asked. "How do you keep going after everything you've lost?" Ruth squeezed her hand gently. "Because the loving is the point," she said. Not the keeping, not the holding on, just the loving. That's the only thing that lasts. They prepared for the baby together. Ruth taught Margaret how to change a diaper using an old doll she had kept in the attic for decades. She showed her how to swaddle a newborn, wrapping the blanket snug but not too tight, tucking the corners just so. She demonstrated the gentle rocking motion that soothed a crying infant, the soft hum that calmed a restless spirit. "My mother taught me this," Ruth said, cradling the doll against her chest. "And her mother taught her? It's been passed down through generations. Now I'm passing it to you." Margaret watched carefully, memorizing every movement, every gesture, every tender detail. She had never known her own mother to hold her this way. She had never felt the comfort of being rocked to sleep, never heard a lullaby sung just for her. But she would give these things to her son. She would break the cycle of coldness and distance that had defined her family for so long. She would be different. One evening, Ruth presented her with a gift. It was a blanket knitted from soft blue yarn, with delicate patterns woven throughout. In one corner, Ruth had embroidered 3 small letters. D.E. "Daniel Ellis," Ruth said, her eyes shining. "I thought you might like the name." Margaret held the blanket against her chest, feeling the softness against her skin. Daniel. It meant, "God is my judge." It was a strong name, a good name, a name that carried weight and meaning. "It's perfect," she whispered. Ruth smiled and kissed her forehead. That night, Margaret hung a mobile of wooden stars above the crib they had set up in the corner of her bedroom. She arranged the tiny clothes in the dresser drawer, folding each one with care. She placed the blue blanket at the foot of the crib, smoothing out the wrinkles with her fingertips. And then she sat in the old rocking chair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered fields, and allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of first steps and first words, of birthday parties and bedtime stories, of watching her son grow into a man she could be proud of. She dreamed of a future where she was enough. And for a little while, the dream felt real. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Margaret's due date. She remembered the day clearly because it had started so beautifully. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in weeks, casting long golden rays across the snow-covered fields. The icicles hanging from the barn roof had begun to drip, and the air carried that faint, hopeful smell of earth beginning to thaw beneath the frost. Margaret had been sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea and watching a cardinal hop along the windowsill, when she heard the mail truck rumbling down the gravel road. Ruth was out in the chicken coop, collecting eggs the way she did every morning, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Without thinking, Margaret pushed herself up from the chair, slowly now, her belly heavy and awkward, and made her way to the front door. The mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, a rusted metal thing that had been there longer than Margaret had been alive. She walked carefully down the icy path, one hand resting on her stomach, the other gripping the porch railing for balance. Inside the mailbox, there were 3 items: a grocery store circular, a postcard from the electric company reminding them about winter safety, and a long white envelope with an official seal pressed into the corner. Margaret glanced at the envelope. It was addressed to Ruth, not her. The return address was a law office in Columbus, Harrison, Mercer and Associates. She didn't think much of it at first. Ruth handled all the household affairs, bills, taxes, paperwork. Margaret had offered to help, but her grandmother always waved her off with a gentle smile. "You've got enough to worry about," she would say. "Let me take care of the rest." Margaret carried the mail inside and set it on the kitchen table. It wasn't until later that afternoon that she saw the letter again. Ruth had come inside, her cheeks pink from the cold, and sorted through the mail while Margaret rested on the couch. She watched her grandmother's face as she opened the white envelope, watched the way her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, A brief pause in her breathing. Ruth read the letter in silence. Then she folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the pocket of her housecoat. "Anything important?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Ruth looked up and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just some legal nonsense," she said lightly. "Nothing for you to worry about." She moved to the stove and began preparing dinner, humming the same old song she always hummed, her movements steady and familiar. But something was different. Margaret could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm when the birds go quiet and the wind changes direction. She didn't press the issue. Ruth had always been a private woman, carrying her burdens in silence the way her generation had been taught to do. Margaret respected that. She trusted her grandmother to share what needed to be shared. But later that night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Margaret crept back downstairs. The letter was still in the pocket of Ruth's housecoat, hanging on the hook by the back door. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the worn fabric. She knew she shouldn't look. She knew it was a violation of her grandmother's privacy, a betrayal of the trust Ruth had shown her. But something pulled at her. A quiet voice in the back of her mind, warning her that not all was as it seemed. She pulled out the envelope and unfolded the letter. The words swam before her eyes, cold and clinical, written in the detached language of lawyers and courts and systems that cared nothing for the people they crushed. Dear Mrs. Ellis, this letter serves as formal notice regarding the outstanding debts associated with the property located at 4527 County Road 12. Due to failure to comply with the agreed-upon payment terms, foreclosure proceedings will commence on or before March 15, 1984. Please contact our office immediately to discuss your options. Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Foreclosure, outstanding debts, failure to comply. She thought about the hutch that used to stand in the dining room, the one Ruth had said she'd donated to the church. She thought about the silver candlesticks that had disappeared from the mantel, the rocking horse from the barn that Ruth claimed had been damaged beyond repair. Ruth had been selling things, quietly, secretly, piece by piece. Margaret folded the letter and returned it to the envelope, her heart pounding against her ribs. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, the other pressed against her belly, where her son slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around them. She didn't sleep that night, and she didn't ask Ruth about the letter. Some truths, she realized, were too heavy to speak aloud. The days that followed moved slowly, heavy with unspoken tension. Margaret watched her grandmother more carefully now, noticing things she had been too distracted to see before. The way Ruth's hands shook slightly when she counted the coins in the old mason jar on the counter. The way she lingered over the bills that arrived in the mail, her lips moving silently as she added up numbers that never seemed to balance. The way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the snow-covered fields with an expression Margaret had never seen before, something between exhaustion and surrender. But Ruth never said a word. She continued to cook breakfast every morning, humming her old songs, shuffling across the linoleum in her worn slippers. She continued to knit the blue blanket for the baby, her needles clicking softly in the evening light. She continued to smile and pat Margaret's hand and say, "Everything's going to be just fine." Margaret wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that the letter was just a misunderstanding, that Ruth had some secret plan, that the universe would not be cruel enough to take away the only safe place she had ever known. But the bills kept coming. They arrived almost daily now, thin envelopes with red stamps and urgent warnings printed across the front. Past due. Final notice. Immediate action required. Ruth collected them quietly, tucking them into the drawer beside the stove, where she kept the matches and the old recipes clipped from magazines. Margaret pretended not to notice. But one afternoon, while Ruth was napping in the back bedroom, she opened the drawer. There were dozens of them, electric bills, medical bills from Ruth's doctor visits, a notice from the county tax office, a letter from the bank with words like delinquent and collateral and seizure of assets. Margaret's hands trembled as she sifted through the pile. The numbers blurred together, but the message was clear. They were drowning, and Ruth had been fighting the current alone, keeping her head above water just long enough to make sure Margaret didn't see how close they were to going under. That night, Margaret heard the phone ring. It was late, nearly 11 o'clock, and she had been lying in bed, unable to sleep, her mind racing with fears she couldn't name. The sound of the telephone cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and unexpected. She heard Ruth's footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of the receiver being lifted. "Hello?" A pause. Then Ruth's voice, low and strained, speaking words Margaret could barely make out through the closed door. "I've told you I don't have it. No, I understand, but you have to give me more time. Please, the farm is all I have left of him." Margaret pressed her hand against her mouth, her heart pounding. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for mercy. Just until spring. I'll find a way. I always do." Another long pause, then a sound Margaret had never heard before, a soft, choked sob, quickly swallowed. "Fine. Yes, I understand." The receiver clicked back into place. Margaret lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as Ruth's footsteps retreated down the hallway. She heard the creak of the bedroom door, the soft thud of her grandmother sitting down on the edge of the bed. And then silence. Margaret didn't move. She didn't call out. She didn't go to Ruth and wrap her arms around her the way Ruth had done for her so many times before. She just lay there in the darkness, paralyzed by a helplessness so complete it felt like drowning. The next morning, Ruth acted as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast. She hummed her songs. She asked Margaret how she had slept and whether the baby had been kicking much during the night. Margaret answered in short, hollow sentences, her eyes fixed on her grandmother's face, searching for cracks in the mask. But Ruth gave nothing away. And so the silence continued, growing heavier with each passing day, filling the spaces between them with words neither of them knew how to speak. Margaret began to feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, wondering how long they had before everything collapsed. She thought about asking Ruth directly. She thought about confronting her, demanding answers, insisting that they face the truth together. But every time she opened her mouth, the words dissolved on her tongue. Because deep down, Margaret already knew the answer. There was no secret plan. There was no way out. They were running out of time. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do to stop it. The baby came early. It was February 9th, a bitter cold night with no moon and no stars. Margaret had been sitting by the fire, trying to read a book Ruth had given her, when the first pain shot through her body like lightning. She gasped, dropping the book to the floor, her hands instinctively flying to her belly. "Grandma," she called out, her voice tight with fear. "Something's happening." Ruth appeared in the doorway, took one look at Margaret's face, and moved faster than she had in years. Within 20 minutes, they were in the old pickup truck, bouncing down the icy roads toward the county hospital. The heater barely worked, pushing out thin streams of lukewarm air that did nothing against the freezing February night. Margaret gripped the door handle with white knuckles, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming as another contraction ripped through her. "Breathe," Ruth said, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "Just breathe, sweetheart. We're almost there." The labor lasted 14 hours. Margaret had never known pain like this, a deep, primal agony that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her body, somewhere ancient and powerful and completely beyond her control. She screamed until her voice gave out, then she cried, then she simply endured, clinging to Ruth's hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. The nurses moved around her in a blur of white uniforms and gentle voices. Someone pressed a cold cloth to her forehead. Someone else told her to push. The fluorescent lights above seemed impossibly bright, burning into her eyes even when she closed them. And through it all, Ruth never left her side. She held Margaret's hand through every contraction. She whispered prayers Margaret hadn't heard since childhood. Old words, worn smooth by generations of women who had faced this same moment, this same fear, this same impossible crossing from one life into another. "You're doing so well," Ruth murmured, her voice steady even as her own eyes glistened with tears. "You're so strong. You're almost there." At 3:47 in the morning, Daniel was born. He came into the world with a cry that filled the room, sharp and clear and full of life. The nurses cleaned him quickly, wrapped him in a white hospital blanket, and placed him in Margaret's arms. She looked down at him and the world stopped. He was so small, so perfect. His eyes were closed, his tiny fists clenched against his chest. A faint dusting of dark hair covered his head, and his skin was pink and warm against her own. "Hello," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, my baby?" She touched his cheek with her fingertip, tracing the curve of his jaw, the slope of his tiny nose. He stirred slightly, turning toward her touch, and something deep inside Margaret shifted into place. This was her son. This was the reason she had survived everything that came before. This was love. 3 days later, Ruth collapsed. Margaret was in the hospital room, nursing Daniel, when a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. She heard voices, urgent, overlapping, and then the sound of running footsteps. A nurse burst through the door, her face pale with alarm. "Your grandmother," she said. "She's in the emergency room. Her heart." The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of fluorescent lights and hushed conversations. Doctors explained things Margaret couldn't fully understand, words like arrhythmia and congestive failure and chronic strain. They said Ruth was stable for now, but she would need to stay in the hospital for observation. Maybe weeks, maybe longer. Margaret sat beside her grandmother's bed, Daniel sleeping in the carrier at her feet, and watched Ruth breathe. She looked so small in that hospital bed, so fragile. The woman who had always seemed unbreakable now looked like she might shatter at the slightest touch. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "I should have told you about the money, about everything." "It doesn't matter now," Margaret said, taking her hand. "It does?" Ruth's voice was thin, barely more than a breath. "You need to think about what's best for him, not for me, not for yourself, for him." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not giving him up." Ruth didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, tired sigh. That night, Margaret walked the hospital corridors alone, Daniel pressed against her chest. She passed the nurse's station, the waiting room, the vending machines humming in the corner. And then she found herself standing outside the chapel. A small flyer was taped to the door. "Hope through adoption, giving children the future they deserve. St. Anne's Adoption Services." Margaret stared at the words for a long time, and something inside her began to crack. The next 48 hours passed, like a fever dream. Margaret moved through the hospital corridors in a daze, her body present but her mind somewhere far away. She fed Daniel when he cried. She changed him when he needed changing. She held him against her chest and rocked him gently, going through the motions Ruth had taught her. But inside, she felt hollow, like someone had reached into her chest and scooped out everything that made her human. Ruth's condition worsened on the second day. The doctors spoke in hushed tones outside her room, using words Margaret didn't fully understand, but recognized well enough to fear. Surgery. Specialists. Treatments that would cost more than the farm was worth, more than everything Ruth had ever owned combined. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching her grandmother sleep, and felt the walls closing in around her. She had no money. The little she had saved from odd jobs over the years had been spent on baby supplies and groceries. Ruth's accounts were frozen, tied up in the foreclosure proceedings that were already underway. There was no family to call, no friends with deep pockets, no miracle waiting around the corner. She was completely, utterly alone. That night, after the nurses had dimmed the lights and the hospital had settled into its uneasy quiet, Margaret found herself in the cafeteria. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The room was empty except for a janitor mopping the floor in slow, rhythmic strokes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. A vending machine hummed in the corner, offering stale sandwiches and candy bars no one wanted. Margaret sat at a table near the window, Daniel asleep in the carrier beside her. She had a cup of coffee in front of her, but she hadn't touched it. It had gone cold hours ago. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass. Who was that woman looking back at her? That hollow-eyed stranger with the tangled hair and the trembling hands. She barely recognized herself. She had aged 10 years in the span of a week, worn down by fear and exhaustion and the crushing weight of decisions she didn't know how to make. The tears came slowly at first, just a few drops sliding down her cheeks, leaving warm trails on her skin. Then more, and more, until she was sobbing silently, her shoulders shaking, her hands pressed against her mouth to keep from waking Daniel. She thought about her mother, who had called her a disgrace and slammed the door in her face. She thought about the man who had promised to love her forever, and then disappeared without a trace. She thought about every time someone had told her she wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't worthy of the life she wanted. And she thought about Daniel. He was so innocent, so pure, so completely unaware of the wreckage surrounding him. What kind of life could she give him? A life of poverty and instability, moving from shelter to shelter, scraping by on food stamps and the charity of strangers. A life where he would grow up knowing that his mother had failed him, that she had tried her best, and it still wasn't enough? Margaret reached into the carrier and lifted Daniel into her arms. He stirred slightly, his tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. His breath was warm against her neck, soft and steady, the most peaceful sound she had ever known. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you more than anything in this world." But love, she was beginning to realize, was not always enough. Love couldn't pay the medical bills piling up on Ruth's nightstand. Love couldn't stop the foreclosure that would take the farm in a matter of weeks. Love couldn't feed a baby when there was no money for formula, couldn't keep him warm when there was no home to shelter him. She had spent her whole life believing that love was the answer to everything, that if she just loved hard enough, held on tight enough, everything would work out in the end. But the world didn't care about love. The world was cold and indifferent, grinding down the weak and the vulnerable without mercy or remorse. Margaret closed her eyes and let the truth wash over her. She couldn't keep him, not because she didn't want to, not because she didn't love him with every fiber of her being, but because keeping him would mean condemning him to a life of suffering, a life where he would pay the price for her failures. "You deserve better than me," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had said the words aloud, and once they were spoken, she couldn't take them back. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat in the hospital chapel until the first pale light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, casting soft patterns of color across the wooden pews. Daniel slept in her arms, his small body warm and heavy against her chest, his breath rising and falling in that perfect, trusting rhythm that only babies know. The chapel was empty, silent. The kind of silence that felt sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Margaret stared at the small wooden cross on the altar. She had never been a religious woman. Her mother had dragged her to church as a child, forced her to memorize prayers and recite verses she didn't understand. But somewhere along the way, faith had become tangled up with fear and guilt and the cold, disapproving eyes of people who claimed to speak for God, but showed no mercy. Now, sitting alone in this quiet place, Margaret found herself searching for something she couldn't name. Not answers exactly, not comfort, just something, a sign, a direction, a reason to keep breathing. "I don't know what to do," she whispered into the silence. "I don't know how to save him." The words hung in the air, unanswered. She thought about the adoption flyer she had seen taped to the chapel door. The idea had been circling in her mind for days now, a dark shape at the edge of her thoughts that she kept pushing away. Adoption meant giving Daniel to strangers. Adoption meant signing papers and walking away, and never knowing if he was safe, if he was loved, if he ever thought about the mother who let him go. She couldn't do that. She couldn't hand her son over to some agency, some system, some faceless bureaucracy that would shuffle him from one family to another until he became just another number in a file somewhere. But what was the alternative? Ruth was dying. The farm was gone. Margaret had no job, no home, no family, no future. If she tried to keep Daniel, they would end up on the streets, cold, hungry, desperate. And eventually, the state would take him anyway. They would declare her unfit, remove him from her care, place him in the same foster system she had been trying to avoid. Either way, she would lose him. The only question was how. Margaret closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. She remembered the first time she felt Daniel move inside her, that flutter of life that had taken her breath away. She remembered Ruth's hands teaching her how to swaddle a blanket, how to rock a crying baby, how to hum the old songs that had been passed down through generations. She remembered the night he was born, the moment they placed him in her arms, the overwhelming rush of love that had filled every corner of her being. She had promised him a better life. She had promised him a real home, a real family, someone who would never leave. And now she understood what that promise truly meant. The idea came to her slowly, like light breaking through clouds. She couldn't give Daniel to strangers. She couldn't trust an agency or a system or a piece of paper to protect him. But there was another way, a way that felt less like surrender and more like sacrifice. St. Michael's Church. She had passed it dozens of times on her way into town. A beautiful old building with stone steps and stained glass windows and a congregation that still believed in miracles. The kind of place where good people gathered. The kind of place where a baby left on the doorstep might be found by someone with a kind heart and gentle hands. It wasn't a plan. It was barely even a hope. But it was something. If she left Daniel there, someone would find him. Someone from that community. Someone who went to church every Sunday and believed in charity and compassion. Someone who might look at that tiny baby and see not a burden, but a blessing. Margaret opened her eyes. The cross on the altar seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. She didn't feel peace. She didn't feel certainty. She felt only a quiet, terrible resolve settling into her bones like ice water. She would not abandon her son. She would give him a chance. Margaret stood slowly, cradling Daniel against her chest. She walked to the chapel door and paused, looking back one last time at the empty pews, the flickering candles, the cross that had witnessed her darkest moment. "Forgive me," she whispered. Then she stepped out into the cold gray morning to prepare for the hardest night of her life. The day passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Margaret moved through the hours like a ghost, her body present but her spirit somewhere far away. She visited Ruth one last time, standing in the doorway of the hospital room, watching her grandmother sleep. The machines beeped softly, tracking heartbeats and oxygen levels and all the fragile things that kept a person tethered to life. She wanted to wake her. She wanted to crawl into that narrow hospital bed and lay her head on Ruth's shoulder the way she had done as a child. She wanted to confess everything, the fear, the plan, the terrible choice she was about to make. But she couldn't. Ruth would try to stop her. Ruth would insist there was another way, that they could figure something out, that giving up was never the answer. And Margaret wasn't strong enough to hear those words. She wasn't strong enough to have hope. So she stood in silence, memorizing the lines of her grandmother's face, the silver hair spread across the pillow, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, "for everything." Then she turned and walked away. The snow began falling around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Margaret sat by the window of her hospital room, watching the flakes drift down from the gray sky. They fell slowly at first, scattered and hesitant, like they weren't sure they wanted to reach the ground. But as the hours passed, they grew thicker, heavier, blanketing the parking lot and the rooftops and the bare branches of the trees in white. Daniel slept in the bassinet beside her, wrapped in Ruth's blue blanket. She had packed a small bag with the few things she would need: a change of clothes, a bottle of formula, the note she had written on the back of a hospital receipt. Just a few words scrawled in her unsteady handwriting. "His name is Daniel. He is loved. Please take care of him." She read the note a dozen times, trying to imagine the stranger who would find it. Would they understand? Would they see past the desperation and the poverty and recognize the love that had gone into every word? Or would they judge her? Would they look at that abandoned baby and see only a mother who had failed? Darkness came early, the way it always did in February. By 6 o'clock, the world outside the window had disappeared into shadow. The snow continued to fall, muffling every sound, wrapping the hospital in a cocoon of silence. The hallways grew quiet as visitors left and patients settled in for the night. Margaret waited. She watched the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes. She had decided to leave at midnight when the streets would be empty and the church would be dark. She didn't want witnesses. She didn't want anyone to see her face or remember her later. This had to be clean, final, untraceable. She fed Daniel one last time, holding him close as he drank from the bottle, his small hands curling around her fingers. She studied every detail of his face, the curve of his cheeks, the shape of his eyes, the tiny birthmark behind his left ear that looked like a crescent moon. "I need you to remember something," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't understand. "I need you to remember that I loved you, that I never stopped loving you, that everything I'm doing tonight is because I love you too much to watch you suffer." Daniel blinked up at her, his eyes dark and trusting. Margaret pressed her lips to his forehead and let the tears fall. At 11:30 she put on her coat. Her hands trembled as she buttoned it, as she pulled the hood up over her hair, as she lifted Daniel from the bassinet and settled him against her chest. He stirred slightly, then relaxed into her warmth, his breath soft against her neck. The hallway was empty. Margaret walked slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. She passed the nurse's station, where a single lamp cast a pool of yellow light across stacks of paperwork. She passed the chapel, its doors closed now, its windows dark. The exit was just ahead. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and biting, stealing the breath from her lungs. The snow swirled around her, thick and relentless, coating her shoulders and her hair, and the blanket wrapped around Daniel. She stood there for a moment, looking up at the sky. Then she began to walk, and with every step, she felt a piece of herself breaking away, falling silently into the snow behind her, lost forever in the darkness. 20 years later. Margaret had tried to forget. She had moved across the country 3 months after that night, settling in a small coastal town in Oregon, where the fog rolled in every morning and the sound of the ocean drowned out the memories she couldn't escape. She changed her name, she cut her hair, she built a quiet life working at the local library, shelving books and helping patrons and disappearing into the safe, orderly world of call numbers and due dates. She never married. She never had other children. She told herself it was because she didn't want those things, but the truth was simpler and more painful. She didn't deserve them. Every year on Daniel's birthday, she lit a candle and sat alone in the darkness. She imagined what he looked like, what he sounded like, what kind of person he had become. She prayed, though she wasn't sure to whom, that whoever found him that night had given him the life she never could. But she never stopped searching. The article appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late January. Margaret was scrolling through her phone during her lunch break when she saw it, a small-town newspaper story shared by an old acquaintance from Ohio. The headline read, "Local priest celebrates 10 years of service at historic church." There was a photograph beneath the headline, a young man in a black suit and white collar standing on the steps of a stone church, smiling warmly at the camera. Margaret's heart stopped. She knew that face. She had memorized every curve and line of it 20 years ago, had traced it with her fingertips in the dim light of a hospital room. The shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the way his smile seemed to hold both joy and something deeper, something she couldn't name. It was Daniel, her Daniel. She read the article 3 times, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. It told the story of Father Daniel Mercer, who had been abandoned as an infant on the steps of St. Michael's Church and adopted by Harold and Vivian Mercer, beloved philanthropists and longtime members of the congregation. It described his journey to the priesthood, his dedication to his community, his unwavering faith in God's plan. Margaret set the phone down and stared at the wall. The Mercers. She knew that name. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. Harold Mercer had been the attorney who handled Ruth's foreclosure. She remembered his face, smooth and polished, with cold eyes and a practiced smile. She remembered sitting across from him in that downtown office, clutching a stack of papers she didn't understand, begging for more time. He had shown no mercy. And Vivian Mercer, she was the woman who had purchased the farmland at auction just 3 months later. Margaret remembered the newspaper photograph, Vivian standing in front of the old farmhouse with that triumphant smile, posing like she had won a prize. They had taken everything Ruth had. And then, somehow, they had taken Daniel too. Margaret spent the next 6 months investigating. She hired a private detective, a quiet man with tired eyes who asked no questions and delivered answers she wasn't sure she wanted. She obtained court records, financial documents, witness statements from neighbors who had lived near the church 20 years ago. What she discovered made her sick. The Mercers had not found Daniel by accident. They had been watching Margaret for months before she ever gave birth. They had tracked her hospital visits, her financial struggles, her growing desperation. They had known, with cold, calculated certainty, that she would eventually break. And on the night she left Daniel on those church steps, Harold Mercer had been waiting in the shadows. He had taken the baby before dawn, before anyone else could find him. He had filed the adoption papers the very next morning, claiming he and Vivian had discovered the child during an early morning walk. He had told the congregation a beautiful story about answered prayers and divine providence. But it was all a lie. The Mercers hadn't adopted an abandoned baby. They had stolen her son. Margaret sat in her car outside St. Michael's Church, watching Daniel greet parishioners after Sunday Mass. He moved among them with ease, shaking hands, embracing elderly women, laughing at something a child said. He was kind, genuine, beloved by everyone who knew him. He had no idea who he really was. Margaret gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had come here to warn him, to expose the Mercers, to reveal the truth that had been buried for 2 decades. But now, watching him smile in the winter sunlight, she wondered if the truth would save him or destroy him. The months that followed were the hardest of Margaret's life. Harder than leaving Daniel on those church steps. Harder than watching Ruth fade away in that hospital bed. Harder than all the years of silence and loneliness and wondering. Because now everything was out in the open. Daniel had not taken the news well. How could he? In the span of a single conversation, everything he believed about himself, his family, his history, his very identity, had crumbled to dust. He had spent 30 years believing the Mercers were his saviors, the kind strangers who had rescued him from abandonment and given him a life of purpose and faith. Now he knew the truth. They were not saviors. They were thieves. The confrontation with the Mercers happened 2 weeks after Margaret revealed herself. Daniel had asked her to stay away, to give him time to process, to let him handle things in his own way. She respected his wishes, even though every fiber of her being screamed to be by his side. She waited in her small rented room on the edge of town, watching the snow fall, counting the hours until she heard from him again. When the call finally came, his voice was hollow. "I spoke to them," he said quietly. "They denied everything at first, said you were lying, said you were mentally unstable, that you had made up this elaborate story to manipulate me." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart aching. "But I showed them the documents," Daniel continued, "the court records, the witness statements, the photograph of Harold's car parked near the church that night." A long pause. They couldn't explain any of it. Vivian started crying. Harold just sat there, staring at his hands, not saying a word. Margaret waited, barely breathing. "I asked them one question," Daniel said. "I asked if any part of what you told me was true, and they didn't answer. They didn't have to. I saw it in their eyes." His voice broke. "They stole me from you. They built their entire family on a lie." The aftermath unfolded slowly, the way justice often does. Harold Mercer faced legal consequences for his role in the fraud: falsifying adoption documents, obstructing official proceedings, conspiracy to deprive a parent of custody. The case made local headlines, and the community that had revered the Mercers for decades was forced to reckon with the truth about the people they had admired. Some believed the accusations. Others refused to accept that the generous benefactors who had donated so much to the church and the town could be capable of such cruelty. The congregation split, opinions divided, old friendships fractured under the weight of revelation. Vivian retreated into silence. She stopped attending church, stopped appearing at community events, stopped leaving the house altogether. The few people who saw her said she looked like a ghost, hollow-eyed and pale, haunted by the consequences of choices made 20 years ago. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their downfall. She had not come back for revenge. She had come back for her son, and her son was struggling. Daniel took a leave of absence from the church. He needed time, he said, time to pray, time to think, time to understand who he was now, that everything he knew had been stripped away. Margaret gave him space. She did not push. She did not demand the relationship she had dreamed about for 2 decades. She simply waited, patient and quiet, letting him find his way back to her in his own time. It took nearly a year. One afternoon in late autumn, she received a phone call. "Would you like to have dinner?" Daniel asked. His voice was different now, softer, more uncertain, but also more real. "There's a little restaurant near the church. Nothing fancy. I just thought, maybe we could talk." Margaret's heart swelled. "I would like that very much." They sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth, the evening light fading outside the window. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with long pauses and half-finished sentences. They were strangers after all, bound by blood, but separated by a lifetime of experiences they had not shared. But slowly, carefully, They began to build something new. Daniel told her about his childhood, his calling to the priesthood, the doubts he had carried even before learning the truth. Margaret told him about Ruth, about the farm, about the night she made the hardest decision of her life. When she finished, Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I understand now. I understand why you did what you did." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's enough," she whispered. "That's more than enough." Some truths take decades to surface. They lie buried beneath layers of silence and shame, hidden in the spaces between what we say and what we cannot bring ourselves to speak. They wait patiently in the darkness, growing heavier with each passing year, until the weight becomes too much to bear and the earth finally cracks open to release them. Margaret had carried her truth for 20 years. She had carried it across state lines and through sleepless nights. She had carried it into the quiet corners of libraries and the empty pews of churches she couldn't bring herself to enter. She had carried it in the hollow space behind her ribs, where a piece of her heart had been missing since the night she walked away from those stone steps. And now, at last, she had set it down. The years that followed were not perfect. Margaret and Daniel did not become the mother and son they might have been if fate had dealt them different cards. Too much time had passed. Too much pain had settled into the spaces between them. There were moments of awkwardness, of misunderstanding, of grief for the relationship they would never fully have. But there were other moments, too. There was the afternoon Daniel invited her to watch him deliver a sermon, and she sat in the back pew with tears streaming down her face, marveling at the man her baby had become. There was the evening they cooked dinner together in his small apartment, laughing at their shared inability to follow a recipe. There was the Christmas morning she woke to find a gift on her doorstep, a hand-knitted blue blanket, almost identical to the one Ruth had made all those years ago, with a note that read simply, "For new beginnings." They were not a traditional family, but they were something. They were two people who had lost each other in the storm and found each other again on the other side. Margaret often thought about Ruth in those quiet moments. She wondered what her grandmother would say if she could see them now. Would she be proud? Would she be relieved? Would she shake her head and smile that knowing smile, the one that said she had always believed things would work out in the end? Margaret liked to think she would. Ruth had taught her that love was not about holding on. It was not about possession or control or keeping the people you cared about close enough to touch. Love was about sacrifice, about doing what was best for someone else, even when it broke your heart. About trusting that the seeds you planted would eventually find their way toward the light. Margaret had made a sacrifice 20 years ago. She had given up her son because she loved him too much to watch him suffer. She had walked away because staying would have meant condemning him to a life of poverty and instability. She had trusted that the universe would place him in the hands of someone who could give him what she could not. The universe had failed her. The Mercers had stolen what should have been a blessing and twisted it into something ugly and corrupt. They had built their family on a foundation of lies, and eventually those lies had come crashing down. But Daniel had survived. He had grown into a man of compassion and integrity, despite everything. He had found his calling, his purpose, his place in the world. And when the truth finally emerged, he had faced it with courage and grace. That was Ruth's legacy. That was the power of love, passed down through generations, surviving even the darkest nights. Margaret stood on the steps of St. Michael's Church one final time. It was spring now. The snow had melted, and the trees were beginning to bud. The air smelled of rain and new growth, of endings and beginnings intertwined. Daniel stood beside her, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming back? Telling me the truth?" Margaret considered the question. She thought about the pain they had both endured, the sleepless nights, the difficult conversations, the slow, fragile process of rebuilding trust from the ashes of betrayal. "No," she said finally, "some truths are too important to stay buried, even when they hurt." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think you're right." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the sun break through the clouds. Then Daniel reached out and took her hand, and for the first time in 20 years, Margaret felt whole. What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments.